Welcome to EQ3 of the Globalisation Revision Guide, and this session is on EQ3, which asks what are the consequences of globalisation for global development and the environment, and how should different players respond to the problems of globalisation. So please remember that this should go alongside your lesson notes, your homeworks, your case studies, and your wider reading. So we start off EQ3 by looking at the idea and concept of development. Now remember, globalization and development are heavily linked together. Globalization has caused development. Development also entails globalization. We can simply measure development by looking at things like income per capita and GDP and HDI and the Gender Inequality Index. But actually, the development cable you can see on screen is a really nice way of summarizing how we can measure development and what it should include. So we have 5 factors. They're environmental, demographic, social, cultural, and political factors. And within those, you can see that economic growth and technology and enterprise are at the heart of both of these. So we've got things like social justice, education and culture, sustainability, personal wealth, freedom of speech, and life expectancy, and many more, of course. And all of these interlink to create development. We need each one of these to be improving for a fully developing society. And just some ideas on economic indicators then of development. So we've got a list of them on screen for you. And essentially, the idea of economic indicators is that they measure well-being and real income. So we've got income per capita, of course, which is the average earnings per person in a nation. We've got gross national product, which is the output of a country, what's produced by it. We've got gross national income, which is the same as GNP, but depreciation is discounted from it. And finally, we've also got GDP, which is the most controversial of these, in that it measures the total goods and services produced by a country. It's not particularly useful at measuring actual development. It's just a raw figure of income for the whole nation. Then we've got some social indicators on screen as well. Now, I've called these composite indicators, and the reason for that is because they also include some economic factors within them. So the Human Development Index, for example, uses life expectancy, income, and years in education. So GNI per capita is linked in with life expectancy and years in education to create a score between 0 and 1, the lower scores being the less developed nations and the higher scores being the highest developed nations. And then we've got the idea also of the GII, which is the Gender Inequality Index. And this looks at reproductive health, participation of women in the workforce, and empowerment of women. And so therefore what this does is it indicates the equality between women and men in society and the participation of women in that full democratic society. And so one more thing we can look at for development in terms of measurements is the Lorenz curve. Now, the Gini coefficient measures inequality and wealth shared across the population, and it scores that population from 0 to 100. 100 being very effective, 0 being not. And you can see there on the left, the first graph, perfect equality, okay, and G1, 0, which means perfect equality. And you can see cumulative population and cumulative participation are equal at a 45-degree angle on the Gini coefficient curve. And that means that we have equal opportunities for all. There is equality right through this population. Now, of course, that's very rare. And as you move right across the screen in front of you, you will see that societies become more and more unequal to total inequality. Now, there are no societies that are perfectly equal or total inequality. We have a mixture of number 2 and number 3 on screen. And as you can see, the curve there is a representation of that inequality in a nation. So, using the Gini coefficient and thinking about the winners and losers of globalization, we can definitely say that billionaires benefit from globalization and their wealth has increased through ownership mainly of global transnational companies. We can also say that developed countries have benefited from the rise of China, and that's because of the global shift towards China and Asia. The rising middle classes, due to factory workers, call centers, etc., have seen higher incomes. And TNCs have also allowed for higher incomes for people and job security as well. However, there are a few losers in the globalization ideal, and they are isolated rural populations, mainly in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, where farming, particularly crop farming, is still the main economic sector. Workers, especially male ones, in old industrial cities due to deindustrialization have lost out. Workers in sweatshops and slum dwellers, due to rural to urban migration being on a mass scale, have also lost out to globalization. And this is all reflected, therefore, in the Gini coefficient we just spoke about. And this is part of some of the major problems with equality in our societies. Now, migration is an issue that I've just mentioned and has caused some tensions in recent years in Europe, but worldwide as well. In 2015, 84% of the United Arab Emirates population was immigrant origin. That was 29% in Switzerland, 14% in Germany, and 11% in the UK. And things that have led to this definitely include open border migration, particularly in the EU, foreign direct investment and transnational companies encouraging workers abroad, deregulation, allowing foreign qualified workers into a nation and into a job market, and also humanitarian crises like the Syrian civil war. These things have all led to a rise in international migration and migration for people, particularly economically for jobs and employment. This has led to, for example, some extremism characteristics in Europe. So we can see on the graph here on screen, non-EU workers, and this is migration by nationality in the UK, has roughly stayed the same despite falling during the 2005 to 2015 period. And the big one that's changed here is EU workers and EU migration, which has risen significantly to the UK during the same time period. And in Europe, we have seen a number of different changes. So, nationalist parties like the Front National in France have seen their support rising significantly. 25% of voters in France supported the Front National in 2014 for the EU elections. The BNP and UKIP in the UK in recent years have seen rises, although falls then again, because of their anti-migration stances as political parties. In France, we've seen also attacks fueled by Islamic extremism. For example, the Charlie Hebdo attack in 2015. And in the UK, we have seen, particularly over the last 100 years, race relations dramatically improving, although there are still issues, because we can see that in the support of some parties who are anti-migrant and potentially racist as well. And we also see tensions over resources like water and energy. And the Mekong Delta is a great example of this. Of course, the Mekong River in Southeast Asia is a river that is shared by many nations. And you can see they include Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, China, Cambodia, etc. And essentially, the idea was to build multiple dams along this river to create hydroelectric power and to manage flooding. And China would benefit from this, obviously, for generating power and economic growth. Thailand would as well. It would aid development in Thailand, and it would also provide extra water and electricity. Vietnam, however, are against this proposal and idea in the sense that they are a big farming nation and that 40% of the farmland in Vietnam is supported by essentially this river water. And reducing river flow then could harm the growing seasons in Vietnam. So we can see here that this is a tension that exists mainly because of resources and also as a result of rising population and migration to these countries. And this is all because of globalization. We also see attempts to control globalization in the world today. And for this, I'd like you to think back to EQ1 really and think about China and North Korea, particularly North Korea, in the way it approaches globalization. So, for example, the internet is banned in North Korea. Kim Jong un does not want people to have access to Western ideas. Instead, an intranet basic system is available. In China, we have seen the internet censored. We have seen social media outlets, for example, being limited in China. And since 2010, we've also seen in the UK pledges to reduce migration numbers in total and limits being put on migration numbers since we have left the European Union. And also, trade protectionism is still a common feature in the world. The USA, particularly in recent years, um, that has tried to control the movement of oil around the world, particularly in relation to the USA itself, in an attempt to decrease the amount of profits other nations are making from resources in the USA, but also, therefore, to control globalization as a whole. We have also seen attempts to try and retain cultural identity. So in EQ2, we looked at how cultural identity is important and how it can potentially be eroded. And this is a case study, which is the First Nations in Canada, as an example of how a group has tried to retain their cultural identity. So this is all about a group of 6 Indigenous tribes in rural Canada in the Northwest, opposing oil companies switching on their region, opposing the extraction of oil, the extraction of a resource, of course, that is mainly used to fulfill development and globalization goals. They already had petroleum developments which have negatively impacted their environmental security and also their existence. And so, what we have seen the First Nations tribes of Canada try to do is resist the erosion of of their culture and to reduce cultural globalization. So we have seen an assembly of First Nations promoting rights and the needs of the First Nations. We've also seen Indian reservation territories in India, and we've seen those being self governed and allowing them to make key decisions about their future. We've also seen 100 First Nations and Inuit cultural education centres being funded by the Canadian government to help preserve their traditions and identities. And so these are all examples of how groups can come together to try and fight back against that idea of a global culture and that idea of globalization creating a global culture. So, this is a really good case study in looking at how groups of people can resist a cultural identity change. And then we also finally had the idea as well of sustainability and ethical consumerism within globalization. So, globalization has led to wide environmental and ethical concerns. We have spoken before in previous EQs on globalization about the environmental problems that globalization creates, particularly the shift to the east in terms of manufacturing. And we have seen things like goods being made by exploited labor in sweatshops. We have seen food imports such as bananas not providing farmers with decent incomes. That same goes for coffee and also chocolate. And we have also seen an excess in the production of greenhouse gases, for example, carbon and CO2, particularly some nitrates as well, that lead to global warming that pose a threat to the entire world. A good example, of course, of these issues is the production of jeans that we all wear in Bangladesh. And particularly, we think here about the example we looked at for this, which is the Rana Plaza incident. Okay. And so, for example, cotton requires a high volume of water, about 13,000 litres, to create genes that we need. And we also use dye and chemicals in those genes, which pollute rivers. Bangladesh's 3.5 million textiles workers are on an average salary of £25 per month. Now, if we compare that to our living standards in the UK, that's very low. And jeans also, remember, when they're made in Bangladesh, the environmental pollution doesn't stop there because they need to be shipped worldwide, which adds to more emissions in our atmosphere. There have been some attempts ethically to try and reduce these issues, and particularly on the idea of farmers gaining decent income from their goods. We've seen fair trade over the last 30 years come into existence. And of course, fair trade is all about combating low incomes and providing guaranteed prices for farmers for their goods. It basically aims to promote sustainable incomes and invest in local communities so they can prosper themselves and create their own globalization and benefit from the globalization process. It aims for those smaller communities to become, as a term we've used earlier on, switched on to globalization. So that is the end of EQ3 as a summary. Of course, remember, you will have more in your lesson notes and readings that you have completed, so please do look at them. But that's a roundup of the key ideas. Please do go back and have a look at EQ1 and EQ2 of the entirety of globalization. And I hope you found this useful.